Hey, willingness to pay is a basic economic concept which determines the maximum amount a person is happy to pay for a particular good or service. This can vary a huge amount depending on factors such as marketing and trends, and can also vary a lot between different customers. Today on LokadTV, we're going to understand why a supply chain department should be part of pricing strategy, and also to understand how statistics can be used in order to determine someone's perception of value. So Johannes, willingness to pay sounds very basic on the surface, but perhaps you could just tell us a little bit more about it.
So willingness to pay is something relatively obvious. I mean, there is, it's a key driver, I would say, behind the demand. And some brands have been incredibly successful in increasing over time the willingness to pay. That's literally all the very successful, soft or hard luxury brands have actually played this game of increasing the willingness to pay over time, and it's a very, I would say, it's a multi-decade efforts for the top brands that exist nowadays. And obviously, how do you do that? I mean, you kind of slowly raise your price point so that basically, if you're buying, let's say, a very expensive watch, it kind of increases value over time. So it's not exactly like you're spending money, it's like an investment and an asset, which is, from, I would say, a marketing perspective, quite a feat to do that. But actually, this is not just for luxury. Apple has been kind of doing the same with the iPhone. If you look at the trend, yes, consumer electronics are getting cheaper, but not the iPhone. The iPhone is just getting more expensive, which is, again, kind of a feat. But bottom line, that's very successful. When you look at it, so why is it impacting from a supply chain perspective? Well, if you create some degree of scarcity, you can basically make your products appear as marginally more valuable, and increase the willingness to pay of your customer base over time. But conversely, if you just flood the market and you end up with massive overstocks that you need to liquidate, and for that you end up offering major discounts, which is typically what is done by many fashion companies, then you're actually shaping the willingness to pay of your clients by creating, whenever you sell a product with $1 of discount, you kind of create an expectation to get again this dollar of discount next time. So willingness to pay is something where actually supply chain has a big role to play, because actually it's not that they have a big role to play, it's that they play a big role, period. So, and what is striking me is that how absent is this very notion from most, I would say, supply chain organization.
Okay, so you say so the supply chain organizations are not involved. So who is the traditional department that's sort of responsible for this willingness to pay and determining a pricing point?
Typically, I think it's more on the marketing side. Some companies have even a pricing division. But fundamentally, the problem that I see is that divide and conquer is kind of working poorly in these situations. I mean, when I mean divide and conquer, I mean we as a large organization are going to decide that we have a team that does the pricing, then we have another team that does the forecasting, and then we have another team that does the planning, and then we have another team that does the production, and then we have another team that does the sourcing. It's like divide and conquer. You separate the problems entirely. But the problem is that you have when it comes to willingness to pay, things, I mean, as I say, you have feedback loops between if you end up producing or purchasing too much, you end up in a situation where you're kind of forced into giving large discounts. So you can't just say we are going to have a team that decide the pricing, and then we have a team that do the planning, and then expect that everything will go well if those two things are not tightly integrated.
Okay, so it kind of works from both ways, doesn't it? Because price is intrinsically linked to demand, but also if you've got lots of stock, then you're going to want to get rid of that stock.
Yes.
So how much can companies actually shape what a consumer is actually willing to pay?
I mean, obviously, when you look at the very, successful brands, I would say quite a lot, quite a lot. I mean, just look at, for example, the expensive watch industry. You went from, the crisis, the quartz crisis in the in the 80s, sorry, where basically, you had like super cheap Japanese watches like Casio, and people were thinking that watches that used to be something expensive, where it was going to be something where a watch would be worth, $10 max, and then, but if you look at it, the hard luxury market has never been, going so well over multiple decades. So clearly, there are ways to shape quite extensively the willingness to pay. Obviously, it's not just a pure marketing gimmick. You need excellent product. The iPhone, the last iPhone is more expensive than the iPhone 1, but arguably it's also much better than the iPhone 1. So and for example, if you look also at let's say very expensive watches, the things that you can get nowadays are literally masterpieces that were simply technologically infeasible 40 years ago. So it's not as if you're buying the same thing just at a higher price. So those brands manage. So obviously, crafting and designing a better product is not exactly in the realm of supply chain, but making sure that you don't undo the effort of the design and engineering department with your supply chain department is pretty much in the realm of the things that where supply chain should be having a positive contribution instead of having a negative contribution to the case.
So it's a real challenge, isn't it? Because it's all very much based on someone's perception of value. So for me personally, I might look at a really nice watch and I might appreciate it's got some great engineering behind it, and I might perceive that watch is worth a lot of money. Whereas someone else might look at the same watch and decide it just looks a bit blingy and it's probably not worth the same amount of value. So from kind of a statistical perspective, how easy is it to kind of understand this person's kind of perception of value?
So indeed, if you're dealing with, I would say, hard luxury, everything is way more complicated just because you have very limited amount of data points. It's not that people have like super complex preferences. I believe that the way people choose a cheap shirt, in a supermarket is also super complicated. To model, because anyway you're dealing with a human with a highly multifactorial perception of that are driving their choices. So it's not that the situation is fundamentally more complicated, it's that fundamentally you have way less data points. But also, interestingly enough, I mean, because there is many companies who are selling much more mundane products than high-end luxury watches, and is that willingness to pay also follows many statistical patterns that are just very mundane. For example, willingness to pay is seasonal for many products. Just an example, let's say you want to buy how much you're willing to pay for, let's say, a swimming suit. Well, if you're in, let's say, April, and you're buying, your suit, you may be using this suit for the entire summer. So you might be willing to pay a good price for that. But if it's like the last week of August, the summer season is kind of nearing its end, and thus basically your willingness to pay for a new swimming suit by the end of August is much lower. So there are pretty much all the products that are seasonal. It's not just the demand is seasonal, is that also the willingness to pay of the clients is seasonal as well. And again, what strikes me is that most supply chain department, or let's say planning division in large companies, you will have like entire teams of people dealing with seasonality profiles of the demand, and a total number of people looking at the seasonality profile of the willingness to pay, which typically is 0. So, which strike me as profoundly kind of at odds with literally just the basic reality of the market.
Is that not what fashion companies do with sort of their end of season sales? You've got at the end of the summer, people would pay a lot less for that swimming suit, and so that's where they're introducing those pricing?
Yes, but as a pure reaction to overstocks. You see, it's not something that is really planned for. They just guesstimate the amount of demand. The willingness to pay has no part in that. I mean, the willingness to pay is analyzed. Usually, it's typically not even quantitatively analyzed, and it's only part of establishing the anchoring price point of the initial price of the product. And then, discounts, if they ever happen, it's just a matter of dealing with overstock. There is no analysis whatsoever from the fact that you see, because it's basically it's kind of a twofold penalty. By the end of the summer, for products that are like as positively associated with the summer season, not only the demand drop overall because there is less people that will be looking into the market for this product, but the few people that remains also have a willingness to pay that is lower. So that's why those overstocks can cost you really a lot of money, because you have those two effects which are distinct: a drop of demand and a drop of willingness to pay. And as far as I know, I would say the vast majority of the companies do not analyze those two elements.
Okay, and are there any verticals where there's companies that are actually doing this well and taking a bit of a quantitative approach?
Oh yes, the travel industry, they have been doing that for decades. When it comes to basically yield management for plane tickets, they have been doing that for decades, and they are, I would say, good to a point that it's typically infuriating, because you end up saying, why am I why do I end up paying 5 times more money for the same flight tickets while it's just 1 week? I'm just moving, my dates from 1 week, and the price can completely explode if I'm the wrong period. Well, that's just, yield management that is very optimized. And it's very rational. I mean, they are if the companies that are not doing that in this industry just disappeared quite a while ago.
Yeah. And it seems it's something that's very personal to a customer. So what sort of level of granularity are we actually talking about looking at it with this kind of approach? I mean, are you looking at it as an individual customer perspective, and sort of how can you actually go about that?
So the interesting thing is that most companies nowadays, they already have all the data that they need. And I'm not talking of social networks or extracting terabytes of data from Instagram or whatnot. It's much more straightforward. It's literally looking at your sales history with the clients. So every single unit that you've sold. I mean, not every single, but like a large proportion of the units that you've sold, usually the clients. I mean, if you're in e-commerce, your 100% of your customer base is identified. But even if you're, I mean, maybe not 1%, close to 100%, because you have frauds, and those people typically, unfortunately, they are not identified. But let's say if we put aside the like 0.5% of frauds, your customer base. And then when it comes to, I would say, brick and mortar retail, you also know your customers to a large extent. I mean, you have like fidelity programs, loyalty programs. So typically, you know anywhere from half of your customers are identified at the point of sale. So you have a lot of data that tells you which client did buy what. So even if you don't have 100%, for example, you can make relatively straightforward analysis of, for example, what is the impact of offering a discount to a client? For example, is this client going to change, his or her behavior and now only return when a discount is offered? You can literally make this hypothesis and test it and see exactly how much you're shaping, the behavior of your clients. And again, it's just basic transactional data that most companies have, part of their ERP or CRM.
Yeah, it's a bit kind of worrying as kind of a consumer myself that there's this kind of idea that a company will know the maximum I'm kind of willing to pay and they're going to nudge me in that direction. I mean, is it kind of interesting in terms of ethics?
I believe so. I believe so. People, the naive observation would say, oh, those capitalist companies, they are trying to be super efficient. It's so bad, they exploit their customers. But, the reality is that having companies super good at, servicing their customers, at being, very, very good at understanding, how much they're willing to pay for something, it's actually, I believe, quite of the essence of most of the wonders that we can see, in the market nowadays. It's obviously, if you think as, what if I have a market where there is only one company and there is one company that does that? Yes, then you end up with a monopoly, which is a terrible thing. What is worse than, a public monopoly is probably a private monopoly. But if you think in terms of, I would say, a vibrant ecosystems of companies that compete, yes, it is very interesting. Because, for example, when I was talking about this, those travel costs that fluctuates a lot, it means that if you're poor, it means that you can travel relatively cheaply if you choose dates where basically the rest of the market do not. So, it literally, you end up with a situation where rich people subsidize transportation costs of poor people because airlines have to deal with like fixed amount investment. You invest in an aircraft, that's like a large upfront investment, and then if some people are willing to pay, I would say, a lot of money at a point of time, then for other people who do not have that much money, they can, by being very flexible with their dates, they can get the same sort of things at a much cheaper price. Ultimately, that's kind of the essence also of, let's say, of very successful companies like Vente Privée, now VP. Either you're very rich and you can buy your Louboutin shoes at full price, or you can decide that you're going to wait 3 years on VP till, one day you might have the opportunity to buy it at a much lower price. But then that means that you have to be very, very patient, and this opportunity may never rise. But you see that's the point that I see is that being super good at tuning those prices, it goes both ways. It also means that if basically people expect better, people think, companies are always going to go toward the slope of producing something that is worse and worse and worse. There is this trope that things get worse over time, and it's if you let companies just do some cost cutting, your products are invariably going to get worse over time. Well, if there is like smart companies that identify that people are actually willing to pay more for something better, again, Apple, I'm looking at you. Well, it happened that it might actually work. You might actually charge more for a product that is better. So if people just decide that they want something more crappy but at a cheaper price, maybe because ultimately there are many products that people are only going to use once or twice, or you would even think of having something that is like disposable, it kind of makes sense also as well. It's so again, I believe that having companies that are very good when it comes to to understanding their market and understanding their pricing, ultimately it's doing a favor to the market as a whole, as long as you have a lot of competition. Otherwise, it's like,
And it's so easy with the internet nowadays to be able to check out what the competition is doing. So in terms of willingness to pay, should we be analyzing all of the pricing of our competitors as well?
Absolutely. That is shaping the willingness to pay, is that it's some things that you can shape, but your competitors are shaping it as well. And if we go back, to Apple, you can see that Samsung has been able to kind of, piggyback on the path opened by Apple, and it happens that the expensive, Samsung phones have been increasing in price as well. So it's literally, it's your customers are shaping the expectations of the market both ways. You can have competitors that just drive, the prices to the ground because they just want to super mass produce and lower the price of their products, or the other way around, they want to kind of go up market and you can actually follow in their path. Obviously, if you want to do that, you need also to improve your products as well, because your clients may not just be willing to pay more for the same thing.
Okay.
But,
so we start wrapping things up sort of today. What can a company do to kind of improve their approach to willingness to pay and improve that philosophy? Because you said it's something they're not doing so well at the minute.
I mean, first, I would say by just doing a reality check is in your supply chain department, is there someone who is responsible for the quantitative modelization of the willingness to pay? If there is none, that means just that you're flying blind, which probably mean that you have a lot of room for improvement. So that's the upside. So I think my first advice would be, first make sure that this part is covered, and then when it comes to cover this part, even very basic heuristics are better than just ignoring the problem altogether. So you can start very simple with relatively crude ideas, but at least you start dealing with the problem instead of pretending it doesn't exist.
Okay, brilliant. We'll have to leave it there, but thanks for your time. So that's everything for this week. Thanks very much for tuning in, and we'll see you again next time. Bye for now.